Okay, it's 3:02. We've got, I think, about half our registrants now in the webinar, so we'll get started. It is being recorded, so they'll be able to go back and watch. Thanks, everybody, for coming this afternoon. My name's Sophie Gatenby. I'm the Research Ethics Manager at the Royal Children's Hospital. And this pre-conference workshop is to discuss how we as HRECs, but also how researchers will be considering the national statement updates that come into effect in 2026, so early 2026 now, specifically section or chapter 4.3, and just generally try and ideas share around what we can do to streamline things as much as possible in a space that is there's never a one-size-fits-all sort of scenario. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I live in a without triangulating myself too much, what was a traditional meeting place of two groups. And I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I will start with explain the purpose and appreciate there's lots of people online. Initially, we thought we would do breakout rooms, but I think we've got too many people. So we've done a quick turnaround. I'm very grateful to have our panelists and people who've joined us to help with this session this afternoon. What I will do is I'll get each of the panelists to introduce themselves when we go to the panel discussion at the end. But first, I'll introduce our first speaker, Gorden McGurk, who is the face of the conference. But I'll let Gorden introduce himself, and Gordon's going to talk to us about consent and assent in the paediatric setting and how this impacts HRECs.
Thanks, Sophie. So you should be able to see this now, hopefully. Let me just get on preso mode. Come on, son. Okay, forget that. There we go. Okay, you see that in preso mode, Sophie? Righto. Let me start. I will just say that I am presenting from the unceded lands of the Turrbal and Yagra people in Brisbane, and I will leave it there. Sophie having done the acknowledgement. You can see from the slide, what am I? Director of Omni Advisory Consulting, Adjunct Professor at Southern Cross Uni. I see Lisa Marlowe's there. Hi, Lisa. Recent HREC chairperson, so I guess I've chaired HRECs for about 10 years, and I'm also, I guess, organising the conference. And Sophie asked me to talk about consent in paediatric research, and in doing the research for it, it's actually pretty good to do that, because I think, having been on an ethics committee, we do make assumptions about consent and assent, for that matter, that I know Scott will talk about after me. That the assumptions are that if you don't delve into it deeply, you may make some assumptions that aren't correct. So I will say also that I'm an unabashed fan of the new National Statement 2025. While I was chairing the UQ Ethics Committee, I was certainly using it. I know that NHMRC have put a bit of a halt to it, but it's a significant improvement from the previous one. So let me stop there with the introductions and get on with the show. Overview, talking about valid consent and capacity. Kind of important, because if it's not valid consent, then it's not consent at all. Importantly, and probably what makes things significantly difficult, is the legislative considerations, whether you as states and territories have to use common law or your own particular flavour of children and young people legislation, especially in relation to the use of personal information. It does make things a bit complex, but I think in summary, for the most part, you use common law unless you actually have some alterations. Importantly, as an HREC chairperson, I think I want to try and get across where the challenges are for ethics committees and potentially what can be done about it, because not having chaired a paediatric committee, but ethics committees comprise whatever the national statement suggests. And one of the questions is that fit for purpose when it comes to areas such as paediatric consent? And I will be interested to see what Scott and Ed say about how they structure their ethics committees, because I certainly have a view. And then you can see assent. Scott's going to talk about that after me, so I won't go into it too deeply. Confirmation and reconsenting and waivers. Now, this will probably take about half an hour, so hopefully not much longer than that, but it might well generate some questions. And here I have some references for the talk. National Statement, Merrill Spriggs from UniML, but that's a reasonably old reference, Understanding Consent in Research Involving Children. Of course, the seminal case of Gillick versus West Norfolk and Wisbech. And in yellow there, I have a more recent England and Wales Court of Appeal decision regarding Gillick competency, which is well worth a read because it does reframe our idea of Gillick competency to some extent. I'll get into it though. A couple of other ones, Paediatric Research, Challenges in Ethics, Damien Rowland for the UK, and you can see some others there, including Louise Owen and Peter Davis, I think, for Royal Children's Hospital in 2024, and Nick Zepsel. Oh, well, Nick always gets a mention in 2007. But I've QR coded some of these as I've gone along, so if I halt for long enough, you'll get the QR codes. Righto, key references. Just thought to give you a slide of some of the key references. So the question about consent to start with, no means no, or in fact, does no mean no? And I think that's a good question because if you look at figure 2 of the national statement, which I'll get to later, page about 80, just after section 4.1.15, and it gives you a table of, assent and consent. And, if you're in the situation of being a parent and providing consent on the part of your child, the questions would be asked are, do you have capacity to consent? Are you stressed, for example? Are you in a position to make rational decisions? So, just because you as a parent might have said yes, the question will always be, one of the questions should always be, do you have capacity to actually consent in the first place? And the reason for that is when we talk about valid consent, and bearing in mind that as far as I'm concerned, the most important things that ethics committees can do are get consent right and get the use of personal information and data right. If you don't have an understanding of what valid consent is, then you probably shouldn't be on an ethics committee. That may be a bit unfair, maybe a big statement, but I feel that ethics committees really should pay attention to what valid consent is, so everyone has the same understanding. So it must be specific, informed, and of course we have the patient information and consent form. And I think Sophie said in the introduction, if you have a 30-page consent form, well, clearly not many people are going to understand all of that. It must be given voluntarily without any coercion. And that introduces the issue of power imbalances or potentially in neonatal situations where parents are stressed about their child. Are they being put under pressure to include their child in research, etc.? It must be given to a person with capacity. And I'm not going to go into how capacity is judged. It's way too big a topic. That might come out in discussions. But you can see that the issue of valid consent is one that is not simple. And ethics committees, during the deliberation and decision-making, really need to be going through all of these things. And of course, we know that ethics committees have a category E member who is the legal member. But, legal members vary from conveyancers to, I don't know, criminal law, to wills and estates, and they know a lot about a lot of things, but the question is, do they know a lot about the things like this? So another question for your ethics committee, do you have the expertise there to actually be making decisions about things like this? So when we look at the legal basis for validative consent, there's three main cases, and I'll just refer probably to the last one where you can see Hart and Heron, failure to warn plaintiff, that the treatment would include electroconvulsive therapy. Chatterton and Garrison, doctor must explain fully the procedure and risks. And then the key health law one, Rogers versus Whitaker, the paramount right of self-determination. If you don't give someone enough information to make a decision, then it's not informed consent. And this was the bilateral ophthalmia case where someone was blinded by virtue of the fact that the clinician in the court's view didn't provide enough information. But what those three cases set out is a legal basis for valid consent. And so, they're useful if you ever want to look at where we get those requirements for consent from. Especially Rogers and Whitaker, anyone that is into health laws, I sort of always intrigued by health law. Rogers or Whitaker comes up a lot. So your ethics committee, again, should be understanding the legal basis for consent. So I've shamelessly taken this slide from Damien Rowland, and you can see there's the QR code at the bottom. There's a YouTube video about, I think it's from last year, some of the challenges of paediatric consent. And the slide's useful because what it does is put in perspective, the sagacious clinician looking at the child, having probably zero clue of what's going on. And then you've got the father standing in the background and the mother overwhelmed, crying on the table. And of course, you have the patient themselves who clearly is not in a position to give any consent. But what it does demonstrate is that it's not a single factorial decision. That clinicians, of course, do have a role in it, but in essence, it's about the patient themselves and the parents, or in the absence of parents, the guardian, or potentially the parents' patriae jurisdiction of the court. And failing that, as we will see, there's an opportunity under the national statement, section 4.3.8, for ethics committees under certain circumstances to provide their consent for research to take place. And that's an interesting one. I don't know how often paediatric committees use it. It's quite a strong power, and you really wouldn't want to be going there unless you were very certain, in the same way that waiving the consent for research, for paediatric research, is another interesting one where ethics committees have the ability to do that. But how often that occurs, I do not know, but I would be surprised if it occurred. Other than for the use of personal information, I'd be surprised if it occurred in many instances. Anyway, just summarizing, consent in pediatric cases clearly, in some cases, does involve the young person, the child or young person, but always involves the parent or guardian unless they are not available. So what I thought I would do is just look at consent in different pediatric situations. And I thought I'd just term them somewhat bluntly as a normal situation. Child might have muscular dystrophy or whatever comes in, has to get blood samples taken. No biggie in terms of taking blood, and therefore there's ability to understand that. And so let's call that on the normal treatment journey, versus sensitive times. So in neonatal cases where the mother has just given birth and the parents do not really want any interference to their child because they're potentially in a vulnerable situation, open to coercion, open to power imbalance, and potentially not having the capacity to make those decisions about the child. Now, I say potentially, I'm not a lived experience person in this regard, so please feel free to disagree with me. But I think there are sensitive times where clinicians and the ethics committees must be sensitive to these potential factors. And the other one I thought I'd use is in emergency research, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, what do the ethics guidelines tell us? Well, of course, I told you I'm an unabashed National Statement 2025 fan. I find it pretty easy to navigate. I'm very pleased at the way that it's democratized, I think, the sort of decision making in relation to those participant groups. It will potentially provide more work for low risk committees, but that's not a bad thing. That it doesn't have to always go through the same full HREC review. What do the guidelines tell us? Well, as Scott will talk about afterwards, they do talk about assent 4.3.4 to 4.3.5, I think. And I've just said here, in assent doesn't mean yes or not. And of course, assent is really a question of whether or not the young person has the ability to understand what's going on or not. And I preface this by saying, if we talk about some complex medical research, it is of course questionable whether parents have the capacity to understand it to the extent required. And I don't mean to be paternalistic, but sometimes things are really complex, and as long as they're given the opportunity to ask questions and even to share this with their family members to ask questions, then I guess you have provided them the opportunity. But for me, the thing with an ethics committee is there sufficient information and understanding to allow someone to make a decision? And if the answer is no, then potentially the parents don't understand either. So, of course, we talk about assent, and assent is involving the young child or young person in the decision-making process to determine whether or not they, I guess, have the capacity to understand it, but also to provide some autonomy to allow them to take part in the decision-making process. But, if the child says, no, I don't want to take part in it, and the parent says, well, you are taking part in it, where do we go there? And again, I'm interested in what Scott says about this, because I'm not going to make any comment about that. But sometimes if the parent's meant to be making decisions on behalf of the child and the child doesn't want it, the parents do, and the child is supposed to have autonomy, then there's obviously a significant tension there. So that is for wiser minds than I, Scott. So I'll leave that one to you. Now, let's just get back to this normal situation. So assent versus consent. In a normal situation, a child might be asked whether they want to take part in it. So it's an informed agreement for them to participate in something. It provides autonomy. It's not authoritative on its own. So there are situations where, as I said, at the assent of the young person, if they don't have the capacity to understand all the research, is informative rather than authoritative, and therefore requires parental consent. And it's not valid consent because they don't have sufficient understanding, or they're not mature enough, or they don't have capacity. Therefore, 4.3.2 to 4.3.4 apply. And in consent, the minor, and I should have defined this, by the way. Minors, of course, I guess paediatric research, I've used it on under 18, but some would refer to it as under 16. But let's just take it as under 18 for the purpose of this talk. The minor has the maturity to understand research. They are Gillick competent, ? And they can provide, if they're mature enough to understand it, they can provide consent themselves, but only when they have capacity. And again, National Statement 4.3.4 will refer to that one. So how do we judge maturity to understand the treatment? And does this maturity automatically mean they can understand research? Well, I think I've sort of prefaced this by saying some research is actually really complex, to the extent that members of ethics committees may struggle to understand it and sometimes have to have explanations from the researchers. Mind you, if it's that complex, then they probably haven't put it in sufficient lay language. Well, traditionally, and I've probably been potentially guilty of this myself, we resort to this Gillick competency. And Gillick competency, of course, comes from Gillick versus West Norfolk case, where a young woman who wanted contraception didn't want to involve her parents in the case. And the court said, well, in actual fact, you don't have to involve them in this because you are sufficiently old to or mature to make this decision yourself. And then you can contrast this with Marion's case, which was the legal framework for special medical treatment for children who can't consent for themselves, where the court has to look at the best interest of the child. And that, certainly in the UK and Australia, because it's precedent here, that would have to go to the family court for a decision. And that's a parens patriae jurisdiction of the court. But we tend to use Gillick competency when we think about the involvement of people in research. Well, what I want to pose to you is the fact that we actually need to think a bit wider than just Gillick competency, for the following reason. Because there are now, in fact, legal limitations on the application of Gillick competency. If we use it as a blunt instrument to decide whether or not a child is able to make decisions about their own research, that in fact contracts outside what the court said, because the Court of Appeal has only just reminded us in 2025, and you can see the reference there, that the Gillick test only applies to the determination of whether a child under 16 has the capacity to withhold valid consent to medical treatment. Now, some, I guess, research, like clinical trial research, might be considered medical treatment. And in actual fact, in the Queensland Guardianship Act, there's a definition of special medical treatment, and in actual fact, clinical trials aren't considered to be special medical treatment. They might be approved clinical research. So if they're approved clinical research, they come under research, and then they're probably under the Gillick limitation as shown on the screen there. So you can see it's not exactly a simple matter of just saying, yeah, we think the child is Gillick competent. Now, you can use that as a blunt instrument, because let's say you want to involve your child on a survey. It's not medical treatment. It's pretty low risk research. Gillick competency is probably fine, but I just want to point out that ethics committees should not be using this as a blunt instrument to determine whether or not a child has the capacity to consent to research, because it's not actually about research per se. So as it says at the bottom there, Gillick is not determinative. Other factors related to research must be considered. And this was a subject of a paper by Lynn Gillam and Barton Hall in 2023, which suggested that you need a comprehensive model for adolescent involvement, so not just that Gillick competency. So it's just something to remember there. Now, can children or young people participate in research if they can't provide assent or valid consent? And the answer is, I think in clinical trials, again, if you meet, yeah, I think the answer is maybe, but it's dependent upon parents, and also, again, the HREC can make this decision. And I say underneath that the national statement is a little bit ambiguous in this matter, and I'll tell you why. It's not that I don't think the points raised are valid, and you can read them for yourself. It's just that if this was a legal situation, you may wish to say you've got clause A, the participation of children or young people is indispensable for the conduct of research, semicolon, and, or semicolon, or. But now when you actually lump all of these together, it's not particularly clear whether or not all of these clauses actually have to be met. So I think it would be useful to actually have a little bit of clarity in that point. I would say you just take them all as a wara and say you have to meet A, B, and C for a child, for an ethics committee to be able to make that decision. But the national statement is just, in my view, a little bit ambiguous, although I do like the clauses themselves. Okay, so moving on from just normal situations, consent at sensitive times. So let's take a scenario of a neonatal situation where a woman's, mother's just given birth, and both, the child might be, I don't know, having irregular heartbeat, or it might be absolutely fine, but along comes research nurse saying, well, how would you fancy your child being involved in the study? Or it might be the clinician, and of course, immediately, if it's a clinician, then there's potentially a power imbalance, so that's a bit of an issue. But there are reasons why this can be a challenge. As it says, the parents might be under stress, the mother might be medicated. At what point is consent valid? So if you have a mother who might have been under an epidural or having a green whistle or whatever, clearly they might not have capacity immediately, and therefore the timing at which you approach them for research is crucial. These are all things that ethics committees have to take into account, and factors that have to be clear and approved in the recruitment process prior to being recruited into research. So I'm fairly sure that any ethics committee members on this call will probably agree with that one. Who should be informing about the research study? So we want to avoid power imbalances. Who should be taking consent? Clearly, someone that's not necessarily involved in the research or not in the decision-making process. Can parents understand equipoise? Kind of a difficult concept to understand sometimes. And as I say, how to manage power imbalances. So all of these are factors to consider. And this 2024 paper by Wooten et al. And Peter Davis, Louise Owen, suggested that, I think they did a comparison of what happened at Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne versus what happens at a hospital in Canada, and made the conclusion that clearly you need early communication. Certainly in Canada, I think they have a lot of nurse associates that do a lot of this research nurse work that aren't involved intricately in that research. Therefore, there's no conflict of interest, and they can actually do the consenting. At a minimum, everyone has GCP training. Not that that on its own means much, but I think the combination of all of these factors certainly helps to mitigate the risk of the challenges faced when trying to obtain consent at sensitive times. But that should never obviate the need for the ethics committee to be across this and have approved the mechanism by which recruitment takes place. Because as we know, all of research, certainly involving this group, has to go through a human ethics committee. So, you can do research under normal circumstances, you can do research at sensitive times, but there are more factors that need to be taken into account that the ethics committee must consider, and more risks you have to manage. I'm fairly sure that that paper, for example, probably provided some sort of best practice factors of what should take place. Now, I think consent for emergency research is really interesting because, well, first of all, parents may be under stress or have concerns for the young person, but in actual fact, the parents may not be there in the first place. Imagine the scenario where a child has been knocked down, comes in, researchers wish to do, traumatic brain injury study, which potentially involves, I don't know, just taking an extra blood sample, not any interventional research as such. Can you take the extra blood sample without consent? And the reason I use this as an example is because we had that very scenario when at Royal Brisbane Hospital some years ago, where the group that wished to do research involving traumatic brain injury wanted to take a sample at time zero, because otherwise, how are you going to determine whether there are markers of traumatic brain injury? The rationale they provided was perfect, but consent wasn't approved. And they said, well, can we use deferred consent? And I said, well, in actual fact, deferred consent actually isn't consent at all. However, potentially one avenue would be you take the blood sample, you store it, you don't use it until such times as you get consent from one of the parent or guardian, the guardianship tribunal, etc. So that's not deferred consent. That is actually, in fact, no consent at all. That's getting the approval of the ethics committee, which, if as I showed, I think in 4.5.8, the ethics committee can give approval if you actually lay out the purpose appropriately for doing that. And the reason I mention this is because the question of deferred, can other forms of consent, such as deferred consent or waiver of consent, be used? And again, the deferred consent in the national statement is not consent at all. So, I think there's other better ways to do it. When it comes to legal challenges, and I'm not saying negligence, but the tort of battery or assault, the question would be, had you gone through the proper process to actually try and obtain consent? If the parent or guardian wasn't there and the young person couldn't give consent, did you go to the relevant court? But more importantly, did you go, sorry about the noise in the background, did you go to the Human Ethics Committee? And by doing so, you're going to save, whoever does it is going to save themselves a challenge for assault or battery in court. But I've said at the bottom there, C. Rowland, the brief summary of consent issues in paediatric research. And in his YouTube video, they've actually done this in this Eclipse study or the FISH trial in the UK. They thought they'd use a model of deferred consent. But that was a bit weird because, the summary of it was, well, it worked pretty well. We did have some people that didn't like deferred consent, but most people could see the value of it. I just don't think that would fly in Australia. Like, I know we have to find a way to do it. But I feel the best way, and I feel the national statement now provides that opportunity, is to go through that process where you actually have agreement from the ethics committee. I have said, can we use waiver of consent? And I feel it would be a very brave ethics committee that would give a waiver of consent for that. 2.3.9 pretty much says, well, in fact, doesn't pretty much say, it does say any time that personal information is involved, and personal information means includes health information and sensitive information for which someone is identifiable, has to be reviewed by a full HREC, and then it goes through the criteria, as I'll get to in a bit, for what is or isn't, for whether or not you meet the waiver of consent. But I think for situations like that, I wouldn't go down the waiver of consent route. I'd be using the 4.3.8 to say the ethics committee can do it under these circumstances. That's not a waiver, that's an approval by an ethics committee of the process for doing this research. So semantics are really important here. We talk about waivers, I won't go into them too much, but there's another way to do this, which I think probably meets the common law and certainly meets the national statement requirements. And I've said at the bottom, how does that intersect with the parents' patriae jurisdiction of the courts? Well, clearly, if there's no parent or guardian, the Supreme Court actually does have jurisdiction to make decisions on behalf of young people if no one else can make decisions. So it sounds confusing. The national statement is quite useful. More interesting is how the ethics committees apply this, and Scott and Ed later on will tell us this. How am I going for time, Sophie, by the way?
You're good. I've just got a hand up. Kelsey has got her hand up, and I wanted to know, Kelsey, did you want to pose a question, or do you want to put it in the chat, or is that a hand that doesn't need to be up? I'll wait. I'll continue. You're good for time. Good
okay, thank you for that.
By accident. No worries, Kelsey.
Yeah, so what does the national statement say about this kind of research? So in the section around in children, where a child or young person doesn't have sufficient maturity, yada yada, if committees can approve it if the participation is indispensable, if the research is likely to directly benefit the child, and it's not against the best interest of the child. Now, best interest of the child is a legal construct, Section 67Z potentially of the Family Law Act. So again, you're saying to your legal expert, tell us what the Family Law Act says about best interests. And this should be, this should be differentiated from interest when we talk about ethics committees making decisions under Section 95, and 95A about personal information. This is best interest in relation to consent and treatment. So again, what it shows is ethics committees have a significant and profound responsibility, but you really have to understand and have the expertise to understand these legal things. One question, Sophie, is this an ethics committee responsibility or is it a governance responsibility? And I'm fairly sure Royal Children's has a wheen of lawyers able to make these comments. But ethics committees that do this without recourse to people that know the law are setting themselves up for a bit of a problem, I feel. The 4.5.21 is about in emergency research, and this tends to refer to older, not minors. However, if it's not possible to obtain consent, researchers can request approval from an HREC, etc. So you can do this on minors and adults, and the national statement provides opportunity to do that. But again, let's make sure it gets done properly. Now, what I want to do is use a bit of a research integrity example. I can't remember which one this is. Oh yeah, this is about reconsenting. I don't know where my reconsenting slide's gone. Oh, there we go. There it is. I just wanted to talk about reconsenting and reaffirmation or confirmation of consent. So for the purpose of this, let's talk about reaffirmation and reconfirmation as the same thing. But reconsenting is a whole different kettle of fish, because reconsenting means you're starting from the beginning again. And that might apply in a scenario where the information's changed, the procedure's changed, you're doing new tests, and you have to go through the process with the consentee to let them know, to give them that specific information, make sure they're informed, make sure they have capacity, etc. So it's like starting from scratch again. That's reconsenting. But there are situations where if you do a treatment on an annual basis or a 6-monthly basis, you may take the opportunity, probably correctly so, to remind the person who's part of your research exactly what you're doing, what they agreed to the last time, and determine whether or not they wish to change their mind. So that might apply when there's a lengthy time between procedures, or where there's inconsistencies in consent records. And I would hazard a guess that those ethics committees that have approved in the dim and distant past for the collection of personal information from, I don't know, let's say 2010, will probably find there are gaps in their information sheets, etc., their paper trail. And if that is the case, they take the opportunity to find them, and before they start collecting samples again, they actually do some reconsenting. Now the question down the bottom is this weeks or months? Well, I would say if you're collecting information or samples on an annual basis, you should be reconsenting on that. And probably, Sophie, you'll have, and Scott and Ed, you'll have a better idea than me. But I'm interested to find out what period of time you feel is appropriate before you make reconsenting happen. I just wanted to use an example of reconsenting just for your own for your own consideration. And this is a situation where clinical samples were collected over a long period, children attending on an annual basis. Consent for samples in initial research was in most cases available, thereby suggesting that it wasn't available in some cases. That's not to say that it hadn't been taken, just the paper trail wasn't there. When the research files were examined, they contained annotations relating to the consenting process. So there weren't definitive consents. There were annotations to the effect of, yes, Mr. and Mrs. X or Mr. X or Mrs. X was okay about it, to that level of brevity, which probably should raise some alarm bells in terms of record keeping. But because samples might have been taken, on an annual basis, that's a long time between drinks or blood samples or sputum samples or whatever it was. And so the question is, should reconsenting have been done, or should it be reconfirmation of consent? So clearly, if I say the notes were vague, you would immediately say, well, this does not fulfill the standard for reconsenting. I'm interested to know what your own standards are. But the question I pose to you is this sufficient for reconfirmation or reaffirmation of consent? Now, I'm going to leave that hanging, and you can make that decision yourself. But the question for ethics committees is, what are your standards for reconsenting or reconfirming consent? I won't go through these in the interest of time, but I will say that if it's reconsenting, it's like going back to square one. You still have to make sure the scripts are approved. They're valid under 5.2.16, you avoid coercion, etc., etc. So there are different standards there for reconsenting versus reconfirmation. But, again, be clear what is required when, be clear what is required to be approved when, and provide that guidance. And these are HREC challenges, and I know we're going to run out of time, but what I will say is that a paediatric ethics committee, I'm sure, will be in a better position to make decisions about paediatric research than a committee that is not specifically constituted for the task. And during the NHMRC accreditation process, I was certainly part of that team, and we would always get in a paediatric consultant to ask questions of the ethics committee to determine whether it was capable of doing it. But I also feel, and I'm interested to find out from our lived experience person on the call, whether or not committees actually have one or more people with lived experience in this area, because I feel that would be an important attribute for any paediatric committee to involve those with lived experience. Noting that every ethics committee member has lived experience of some sort, we do not all have lived experience in that paediatric research space. So I feel that's probably an important attribute. The only other point I will say is that the legal members must understand, and probably all ethics committee members should understand, paediatric consent, and that may well be something you do training in, but I feel that is one of the most important things you will have to do. So I'm going to leave that there. Slides will be available. There's a QR code at the end where you can have a look. I did just want to say that there is a significant amount of relevant legislation. Helpfully, this was taken from New South Wales Health, but you can see that for the most part, there's common law applies in most states, but except where states and territories have their own flavour of consenting. Now, Children and Young People Act, for example, refers to special medical treatment, not necessarily to research. So if it doesn't refer to research, then the common law applies, and the national statement is important there as well. And helpfully, this is figure 2 on page 80 of the national statement. This tells you when assent and children and young person consent and parental consent is appropriate. I'm sorry for rushing through it, but too many slides, not enough time. Importantly here, what it does say is, if you look at the bottom row, the mature young person, so this is someone who understands, who is judged to be competent, understands the research, doesn't have to give assent, can give consent themselves, does not require a parent. So in order to answer the question about does yes mean yes, in this question, in this particular scenario, the consent of the young person does mean yes. The parent doesn't have to be involved. So that's a really useful table on page 80, just after section 4.1.15 of the national statement. Now, I'm going to finish just briefly, Sophie, talking about waivers of consent. I briefly touched about waivers of consent for interventional research. I won't go into that too much, but suffice to say, I will just reiterate that ethics committees do have the opportunity to do waivers for research, but the research has to be low risk. There has to be impractical to obtain consent. There has to be no reason to think that anyone would have said no. And importantly, as I'll just show in a minute, the legal one, that's part I of section 2.3.10, it's not against any state or territory law, is important. Importantly, though, what I want to talk very briefly about is consent for the use of personal information, and this is something that, scandals and data breaches notwithstanding, ethics committees will have to deal with this on a regular basis. So this is a paper by Nick Zepps, Waiver of Individual Patient Consent in Research. It's a 2007 paper, but it still holds true, I feel, where it said ethics committees can manage the need to uphold basic principles without impeding social research. But ethics committees should be familiar with Section 95 to Daisy and Section 95A of the Privacy Act in addition to the national statement. And I will say that having looked at all of the returns from all of the ethics committees in Australia while at the NHMRC, and finding out that the sum total of ethics committees that applied Section 95A or Section 95 guidelines amounted to, I don't know, sometimes 5 for every ethics committee in Australia out of 200. I feel there's just a lack of understanding of when Section 95 and 95A should be applied. And I think, again, that's something that I feel ethics committee should be on top of. Important bits of the waiver, I've just said, impracticable to obtain consent, but Section D is relevant here. There's no known or likely reason for thinking that participants would not have consented if they would have been asked. And you can see sufficient protection of privacy, and the waiver is not prohibited. But just take Section D, keep that in your head. No known reason for thinking participants would not have consented. And then we have the IMED issue, where an ethics committee provided a waiver of consent for IMED to release millions of records for AI training. The Australian Information Commissioner has said that she didn't think these were identifiable. I think someone in the last session said, but there's a lawsuit. So, the standards of identifiability and privacy are interestingly different. It'll be interesting to see if a lawsuit exists. But one person's de-identified data is another person's identifiable data. So again, ethics committees be very clear that something is not identifiable before you decide that the Privacy Act and other legislation doesn't apply. So I'm just going to finish with a quick scenario about personal information. And this is a situation where an ethics committee provides a waiver for the use of sensitive health information, which is the same as personal information. But when we say sensitive, and we in one of our committees use the term that the one-armed albino test, and that is if the information is sufficient that only one person in Australia or a handful of people in Australia might be identifiable from it, then clearly it's identifiable. So again, I think the one-armed albino test is quite a good test. But because of the rare genetic condition, the patients can be identifiable. And if the parent of one of the children was made aware that this information had been provided between institutions via a waiver and then objected to it, and you remember I said under 2.3.10D that there's no reason to think that anyone would have objected to the release of this information. The question then becomes, should a waiver of consent be provided? Now, that's pretty hard for ethics committees to make a decision on, and sometimes you might use the 80-20 rule or the 99-1 rule, potentially in this case. But, people have autonomy. They should be able to make the decision about whether or not their information is used or not. That brings in the issue of when does it become impracticable. So, again, ethics committees have a profound responsibility when they decide to approve a waiver of consent for the use of personal information. And in this particular scenario, there was probably quite rightly a very unhappy person. And I think it does demonstrate that ethics committees have to be very clear about the information the approval they're giving to approve a waiver of consent, and consider those sections C and D very carefully. I've mentioned Section 95 and 95A. I'm not going to talk about them. Suffice to say, though, that they are very important. Whenever you waive consent, you must determine whether or not you weigh the public interest in research versus adhering to the privacy principles versus not. So, Sophie, I'm going to finish there. I've probably got on too long. I haven't really stopped for breath. I'm sorry, it's been a bit of a tour de force. And happy to answer questions. And you might just move on to Scott right now because I've taken so long. So thank you for your attention. I hope it was useful. It's a very interesting and slightly complex area, and I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Gorden. You're right. It is a very complex area, and it's really one of the biggest challenges is being across different states and having these different legislative frameworks and having to apply the ethics. Ethics is one thing, legislation is another, and how do they intersect? We might move on to Scott. What I didn't say at the beginning is if you've got any questions, you can put them in the Q&A and I can bring them up at the panel discussion, or you can put things in the chat. That's also fine. Please make them questions about this session rather than general questions. If you've got general questions, we can send you elsewhere. the other thing I was going to say is I'm no longer green and I have not been to Wicked. So thank you for those people who commented on my greenness. I did get green for a while there, and I'm not sure why. It must have been my camera. But I think we're all good now. So I'm going to hand over to Scott, and Scott's going to pose a bit of a question, and I'll let Scott introduce himself, and then go ahead, Scott. Are you there, Scott? Cool. I can see your presentation. Great.
Cool. All right. Yeah. Everyone can see the presentation that's come up?
Yep.
Okay. So my name's Scott Fisher. I am a medical researcher by training. I am the manager of the Child and Adolescent Health Services in Perth, Western Australia, and I look after the Ethics and Governance Committee there. I work with Ed, who is on the he's our HREC chair, who's on the panel discussion later on today. So today I've been asked to give a little presentation on assent, and this really came about because I've spoken to Sophie in the last couple of weeks. I've just started work with CARS mid-August, and a few things popped into my head with reading the 2025 National Statement and the new Good Clinical Practice R3 revisions that are now including assent in their documentation. And I was having some questions about how we deal with the concept of assent and how that's worked into our ethical considerations, and also how that relates to law in Australia. So first of all, just want to have a quick acknowledgement of the country. Sophie's done it, but I just want to acknowledge I'm presenting on the Whadjuk and Binarab Budja and recognise the people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the land, sea and waters of which I'm presenting, and also want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. So Gordon's just given us a great rundown of consent, and in that introduced the concept of assent. We'll all be aware that assent is really a term that's been used to describe how we get a child's agreement to participate in research, and how that child, particularly when that child doesn't have the requisite capacity to provide valid consent themselves. Now, this doesn't mean that it's consent as Gordon accurately described previously. We still need parental consent to have valid consent in these cases if all the appropriate actions are taken. But it also allows the capacity to understand when a child has some sort of capacity to understand what's going on and have them partake or understand their role in the research that's being proposed. So I guess it's a way of determining, giving some self-determination to the child that is going to be the subject of the research that's being proposed. And it's different from the ability that we spoke about right at the end, where Gordon mentioned that when a child is old enough and has been deemed to be what we would sort of term a mature minor, for lack of better words, where they are able to give consent to the research, even though they may be sort of 16, 17 under the minor age legally, and parental consent isn't valid in those situations. So it's a different class, I guess, that we're talking about there. So the emphasis really is on the respect on the communication and the engagement. Sorry, I'm just going to get rid of my screen so I can see. Here we go. And to make sure that those children are included in the research. It is now, as I mentioned, included in NHMRC National Statement in the 2025 version, which is coming into play fairly soon once NHMRC fix up Section 4 of the HREA, and is also mentioned in the ICH Good Clinical Practice Guidelines that will be coming into force over the next 12 months and certainly enforced by the 1st of January 2027. Now, the issue that the confusion I had with assent, or questions I had about it, were more to do with the fact that assent, the terminology itself, is not recognised by Australian law in any jurisdiction. Now, most things in ethics, there's some things in ethics that aren't distinctly recognised in law, and that's fine. And that just because it's not in law doesn't mean it's not a useful tool to have. But also noted that when I was doing some research on this back in, I found the HREC May 17 guidelines, and this prompted me to email Sophie to say, okay, how do we deal with this? Because it's clearly defined in the HREC guidelines that it's not endorsed. Mind you, these are from 2017. We're sort of favouring, or I guess we have favoured use of alternate terminology, whether that be agreement or acknowledgement, that the child, we provide an option for a child in the PCIF to, when they're deemed to be a mature minor, can sign and say that they acknowledge that they're partaking in this work. And my question, I guess, is really, is that similar to assent, or can be considered interchangeable with assent, or does assent hold a higher meaning? And therefore, how do we work around that? And given the differences and the non-recognition of assent in the legal context, does that create an issue for HRECs moving forward? And so what I really wanted to pose today is not so much give you a rundown on assent and how things work, but find out from everybody what they're doing. Are you experiencing similar sort of issues or questions, and how you've been dealing with those? So, how, as an HREC, Gorden mentioned this before, how as an HREC do we assess the capacity for assent, and where do we draw those lines? And, is someone who's 12, 13, 14, can understand a bit but not enough, or is someone who is sort of 16, 17, or do you have a really smart 13, 14-year-old that can actually understand what's going on, compared to, say, maybe a 16, 17-year-old who's a little bit indifferent and not that interested? And likewise, bearing in mind that if you have a child who, his parents say they can be part of a study, that child doesn't want to have a blood taken, etc. You've got different issues there. So you're not going to obviously hold a child down and force them to partake in a study in any sense like that. So that's the questions I just really wanted to sort of put out there and keep it very simple, and hopefully just evoke some discussion that we can have with the panel, and really leave it to the panel members and yourselves to ask these questions and see how we're all reaching with that. So I will stop sharing now, get everybody back on my screen so I can see what's going on, and leave that there. So very, very, very short, just more to put it out there as a question, and hopefully we can discuss more in the panel Q&A.
Thanks, Scott. I think it will be an important one to come up during the panel discussion. I'm just reading a chat message from Sarah, and this is a really good point. The difficulty also comes from individual circumstances. A child diagnosed early in life with an ongoing disease have a higher medical literacy than some adults. And I'll talk to that a little bit in my my sort of brain dump as well, which is what I'm calling my talk. How do we think about how understanding changes over time, and what are our requirements, and when someone's capacity to assent turns into capacity to consent, and how are we going to be monitoring that, and what will our requirements be in terms of asking researchers to report when you're reconsenting, and Gorden touched on that as well. So yeah, keep any of the questions coming through on the chat, or any comments. And like I said, anything that you want raised during the panel discussion. I'm going to talk now in my role as a research ethics manager working with the Children's Hospital HREC. And first, when I read the changes, especially around assent, I was like, oh, we've already sort of been doing that with getting agreement. But then I had a big I gave myself some time to go through each of the changes, all of section 4.3. And I was like, what do we really need to be thinking about when we apply this? What are we currently doing? What might we do differently? And I don't think that it's necessarily what's been changed in words in the national statement only that sort of generated what I've thought about and what I think we should be thinking about differently, and what sort of evidence we need from researchers in the research ethics applications. It's the whole, it's broader than that, and definitely intersects with the lived experience voice, and ensuring that's heard for young people. I don't have the solutions. I've just given it some thought, and I wanted to share those things with you, so it would hopefully be useful for HRECs and also other people who work as research ethics and governance, but also interested to hear from researchers as well what they think will work. Let me share my screen. Not that one. This one. Okay, we got presenter view. I can't see you guys now, so can someone verbally?
Not yet, Sophie. That's not presenter view yet.
Oh no. Okay. It's presenter view for me. That's a problem, isn't it?
I'm just doing it. It'll happen eventually. Just keep tapping that button. Took me 2 or 3 goes.
Sometimes if you go to the slide, show up the top 2 on that tab.
All right, hang on. Slideshow. Not working?
No, not yet.
Not yet, no. And try the one down at the bottom right there, that presenter button.
So you're not seeing my screen at all, or are you just not seeing?
Yeah. You've got a screen. It's just not on
screen.
presenter view. It's just on normal PowerPoint view.
Oh, I've tried several of them.
That one, that will work. Convinced. It's not going. I think just carry on. So
I'll just carry on. That's a good idea. All right. Let me see you guys. It's better if I do it full screen, isn't it? Okay. So you can see enough. I can't see anybody and I can't see any reactions. So if you need to butt in, you'll have to speak up. So I'm titling this talk, and it's a bit short talk, and I'll try, and it's more just from my perspective of trying to operationalize these changes and having a good think about what we should be expecting to see in ethics applications. So I've called it a journey through 4.3. Looking at what's changed from the 2023 and previous versions to now, and these are the areas. Obviously, assent has been added, and that's a big one, and hopefully we'll have a conversation about that during the panel discussion. There's been some clarity around the parental role in consent and balancing the child voice and their developing capacity. Also, where one or more parent might need to be involved in the consent discussion. Risk framing. So all section 4 has sort of reframed the risk and gone away from this vulnerable groups concept, and we've now going away from focusing on specific risks and labeling groups as vulnerable, and rather looking at the risk in terms of the context and the individual person who's experiencing that research. Review level, therefore, was previously often escalated to HREC based on kids being involved, and now there's more sort of scope for a risk proportionate review, and that's been encouraged. Communication, plain language was expected in the previous versions, but now there's a much more stronger wording around developmentally suitable consent, not only content and material, but also the procedures. Safety protocols have also got a bit of a bigger look in. So we're looking, previously we had more general requirements. Now there's quite specific around saying what we need to see to ensure that, there's child safety is being met. So I'll talk first about risk framing. I'm trying to pose these in terms of what has stayed the same and what has changed and what we need to think about. So from our perspective at the Children's, we actually haven't required that all paediatric research went to HREC. If we did that, we would be meeting very, very often. So we've taken a risk proportionate approach prior to this, and we've done that with a number of things, as well as research in pregnant women. If we were approving a project that was a survey with some pretty non-emotive questions, we wouldn't be asking that survey to go to HREC. So it's good that the National Statement Section 4 has now reframed that need, and that a risk proportionate approach has been sort of encompassed there. We do say that having a paediatric HREC and having that paediatric expertise sort of allows us to be able to make decisions around what can go through a low risk pathway and what can go through HREC. So it's having that expertise that helps. When I think about risk framing for paediatric research and some of the projects we've had come through our HREC, I do worry that we are out of touch with how young people think about different risks. And Gordon alluded to privacy risks and those sorts of things, and what, for some people, their attachment to privacy is very different. We've had projects come through using different apps where information goes to certain places, and at times I worry that perhaps we're being we're representing young people without having any young people on the committee and making decisions about what they may or may not be okay with. The other thing that I think is important with risk framing in paediatric research is, interviews and unopened questions, even consent discussions themselves could result in a disclosure that needs to be managed. So this goes to this safety reporting thing as well. So we've come to a bit of a decision about how we're going to manage that, and I'll share that with you shortly. So communication in terms of the information statements and consent forms, to date, we have we've looked at the mature minor, and then so if you're a mature minor, you have capacity to provide consent in addition to your parental consent. If you are not a mature minor, you may have that capacity to what we've called agreement to take part in the research. So that to me is going to be the one that shifts to the assent group. We've been quite strict up until now, and I think some of the other sites that we do multi-centre applications with around ensuring that the information statement for the parent is the same as the child. So whilst they each get their own form, the content is the same. It's just directed to a different person. So it would be you versus your child. So if you're the mature minor and you're the parent, you're both signing the same thing in consent. And I think that's something we will need to rethink. One of our low-risk members made the point that, comprehension and literacy are very different things, and what do we need to be providing to an audience of young people so that they can actually understand and, provide consent or assent. What I think we are going to have to do what we're going to have to think about changing is young people should be reviewing and helping to develop content. Maybe they should. We should ask them whether they should. Reading an ICF is very boring, even for an adult. So it was this, around 30-page ICFs. What is it really informed consent? And is it necessary for us to have the consent forms the same for an adult and a child? I'm not sure. Assent or consent, they'll need to document the pathway. So I think one thing that it is in the HREC paper that was mentioned before, but I think that we need to do that a bit better. Like, how is the assent and consent discussion happening, especially if there's this assessment around that assent versus consent capacity? Should we be having qualifying questions to better gauge understanding? So there is that tick box at the end, or they read the ICF and then they effectively go through these questions and I'm consenting to this. But I don't know whether that needs to be more of a discussion and for our HREC to see how that's happening. I'm sure there is a discussion that goes with it, but consent doesn't happen in a vacuum, but we get these long consent forms, and really, how is that understanding being grasped? The other thing that I'm really I've given a lot of thought to, and I think we need to be thinking about as paediatric HRECs and paediatric researchers, is explaining the extended and far-reaching implications for extended and unspecified consent, especially where this is coupled with a therapeutic intervention. So, if you, for example, taking part in a research project or a clinical trial, and you're sending tissue or data overseas, the child didn't have capacity to provide consent. Where's the responsibility to get that reconsent and to let that child know, and thinking about, what are we asking for researchers to do, and how should we be working together to try and ensure that children or young people are given the opportunity to have some autonomy over their samples and data into the future. And I think keeping in contact with a cohort to facilitate reconsent is something I think we should be thinking about too, and just how that gets done, and making sure that there are resources there. And if the resources aren't there to do it and it's not going to happen, then giving us an ethically defensible argument for why it's still in the best interests of the children to do so. Safety protocols, like I said, is something that has been elaborated on in this section. I think we'll have to decide what will be referred to the institution, so as at a governance level rather than an ethics level. I know there's mention of working with children checks in the section for chapter 4.3. I don't feel that I want to receive everybody's working with children check, but it will be good for us as a sort of collective network to decide how we're going to manage that and whether that will be a governance thing. I think from a multi-site ethics application review, what does the ethics committee need to see and what can be part of governance? Any open-end safety protocols, so any open-ended question or interview have the potential for disclosure that may require an action. So I think what we've decided at the kids is that we will have a standard like default response for those circumstances, which will engage with the risk, the institutional risk management. But, you know, it shouldn't, any potential disclosure, if it's not foreseen, shouldn't stop us from being able to put that research application through a low-risk pathway. So the other thing that's changed a little bit is the parent and guardian role, or rethinking that parent-guardian role, where there is, I'm fine with the Gillick argument where there is a therapeutic benefit. We would be referring the decision to the parent. But if a young person dissents to taking part in project, what have we done at the Children's to date? We've sent them, it becomes a clinical ethics conversation. And, you know, that we are a organisation that focuses on family-centred care. So, you know, we have that resource at the Children's Hospital, and that sort of ends up going through a clinical pathway. I'm interested to think around what is the parent or guardian's role in assessing their child's capacity to consent or assent. I would, working out, you know, we, in the current advice from HREC, it talks about, you know, the clinician assessing capacity, but research is more vast than just clinical trials. So and will parents have a role in saying, oh, my child can or cannot provide consent or assent? What will we explain to parents and young people about the different pathways for consent and assent and what that means? And maybe we won't say anything, but these are all things that I'm thinking about. And then we're considering circumstances where both parents may need to provide consent. That's another thing that's been clarified in the statement. So, I mean, we've thought about putting that in our consenting guidance at the kids and at MCRI. Capacity is something that I think we will want to see more of a detailed detail in the protocol or elsewhere about how capacity is assessed. So the other thing around capacity is that it may change over the duration of the research. I think Gorden spoke to that. So if a young person has not been deemed to have capacity to consent at the start of the research project, when should capacity be rechecked? And I think we should be thinking about that as HRECs and also as researchers. Capacity also may be impacted by the content and effort made to develop materials suited to the audience. So in addition to what was said in the chat by Sarah before, like, you know, kids who have grown up with a chronic disease might have, you know, better health literacy, but also you might start off being a kid with diabetes who starts in a project, but after you've been in the project for a year, you might be able to give consent because you've got a much better understanding. So thinking about how we manage that, but also what should we be expecting from, you know, commercial sponsors and also other research projects in terms of developing material that facilitates, you know, people being able to have capacity to give consent. So you could have the same research question and two different recruitment consent material and pathways that allows something to be informed or not. I think a little bit about dissent, but I might actually bring those into the questions at the end, because otherwise I will end up going for ages as well. You know, thinking about this changing nature of being able to consent versus assent, and then different parts of studies, like you might have capacity to understand part of the study, like, you know, or your parent might be able to overrule your desire to take part in a clinical trial, but, you know, all those other optional parts, should we be thinking about splitting them up and saying you don't need to do, you know, a child should be able to make the choice as to whether or not their samples are kept forevermore. So this again is just another clarifying point around where there is capacity to consent, a young person's refusal should be accepted. But as I said, it could be overruled where there is therapeutic benefit. And I think I've already spoken to this, but where there's unspecified or extended consent beyond that clinical trial, what right does the child have to say no to that or yes to that, or you know, what should we be encouraging in terms of going back and reconsenting to those things? I'm not going to speak about assent and consent. I think everyone has covered that enough, so I'll skip. This is another one that really struck me as a potential problem, and I'll be interested to know what the lawyers think about this. So we've said in very specific circumstances that assent may be appropriate. So that's assent that we acknowledge is not consent, and the HREC would have to decide that it is ethically acceptable to do so. But if assent's not acknowledged in any of the legislative framework, then are we going to have to get a waiver of the requirement of consent, or is there another way of dealing with that? There is a mention of impracticability in these guidelines as well. Consent is not static, and I've thought a lot more about this lately. What role do parents have in assessing unspecified and extended consent for data and tissue? Like, what is best practice going forward? Why, as a paediatric group, can we put some parameters around, when kids should be reconsented, and it'd be hard to. We still have to think about each project as a new project and having different risks, but it would be good for us to think as a network and a group, how do we put some sort of standard advice around that? And this flowchart was from the HREC paper that Scott spoke to before, around the clinical trial consent and assessment of capacity and whether or not a child is a mature minor. And the HREC paper did speak about reconsenting and the changing nature of consent. So in terms of operationalising this, the consent process should be better documented. I think in our applications, we should be asking for more detail around how that will be done, not just seeing the 30-page consent forms and being told why this is an appropriate way of doing consent. Details around how capacity is assessed too. That's not something that we've asked for a lot, but I think with these changes, that's something that I'll be seeking advice from the HREC and also researchers around how they will be assessing capacity. Even a young person is unable to provide consent, like when is that capacity revisited? I've spoken to that quite a bit. And then we need young people to tell us what they think. And we've for a long time spoken about getting a young person's voice on our HREC, but and we've interviewed people, but it's actually really tricky because the HREC meeting itself is, a really long meeting, and it might not suit a young person. And so trying to change the way we even do our meetings to facilitate that voice, or at what point does that voice get heard along the research journey and the application? So these are just some working questions that I have that I would be posing back to researchers at this point in time when I haven't got a standard policy procedure of how I'm going to deal with it. But I'm happy to share that with you. But again, it just speaks to those things that I've mentioned, assessment of capacity over time, when will you reconsent? So to summarise, we need to ask young people what they think, and not just about what they think about the research, but the recruitment strategies as well, and assessment of capacity to consent. I hope to see more details on assessment of capacity in the protocol or elsewhere. Perhaps that will go into the HREA. There might be some good questions in there. Start seeking details on how efforts for reconsent or recontact will be made, acknowledging the changing nature of capacity. Like, I don't think this will be sorted straight immediately, but it'll be good to sort of start planting the seed with researchers around how they're going to do it, because we also want to hear from researchers how they can feasibly look to reconsent and recontact. I definitely think we need to do some further thinking about allowing extended or unspecified consent where a young person doesn't provide their own consent, and whether or not we can even do that without an effort to try and get their consent when they become of age. Become of capacity to provide consent. And it would be good to confirm for us, this one of the solutions that we're going to work with is a confirm agreement on a default pathway for unexpected child safety disclosure for lower risk research, so things that we don't expect but could come up. And complete consent guidance on circumstances where one or more parent needs to be consented. And work out, if we permit assent only for a research project, do we need a waiver? And maybe I've just read that wrong, but it does make me think that there's a lot more work to do. So that's me done. I use some of similar sources to Gorden, and I'll stop sharing. And I can see the panel now. We've got some questions in the chat. Yep, feel the information sheet has to be different compared to information design. Yes, we spoke about, there was a really good talk, I think it was at last year's conference, for a really well-designed information statement consent form for people with aphasia, and posing questions back in a way that provided them the opportunity to, researcher and participant, to confirm that consent. So what if Kai said the times we've received different versions for young people versus adult, the HREC has requested that the young person version is used for everyone. Yep, that's right, because the young person's one is usually better. The legal question around 4.438 is interesting. It's not a waiver as it doesn't meet the criteria, but it does allow the HREC to step in and shows of the decision maker, which is usually a guardianship or similar decision. So that is my talk done, and now I think we might move over to the panel discussion. We've got a few. What I'll ask first is that everybody introduce themselves, just so you can get to meet everyone from their own perspective. Gordon and Scott have already introduced themselves, so I will start with Beck Doyle. If you could introduce yourself, where you're coming from, and then we can start talking about any questions.
Hi everyone, my name's Beck Doyle. I'm the chair of the HREC at Children's Health Queensland. I'm a paediatric nurse by background, and I've been on our HREC for about 10 years.
Cool, thanks Beck. Ed.
G'day, Ed O'Loughlin, anaesthetist by trade, chair of the Paediatric HREC across in Perth. I've done that for the last couple of years, and on a paediatric HREC, a general HREC for about 10 years before then.
And Dalal.
Hi, my name is Dalal. I'm a mum to a child with an ultra-rare genetic condition. And with that, my pathway has changed, sort of. So I've used my education and project management skills to support students at the School of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Sydney, and help them curate inclusive designs for their projects. And I also work with the Centre for Child and Adolescent Health Research as their consumer lead engagement person.
Amazing. Kaya.
Hi, I'm Kaya. I'm Director of Research Operations at RCH, also a paediatric nurse by background, and have been in the researcher side and the clinician side prior to this.
Amazing. Gabrielle, you're the final person.
Hi there, Gabrielle Donlevy. I'm the chair of Sydney Children's Hospital Research Ethics. I have a background in clinical research and as an allied health clinician. And I also have an appointment at the University of Sydney, where I get to continue to work in inherited neuropathy and rare disease research. So I'm straddled two hats.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm just going to start off. Please, I invite anyone to put questions in the chat or the Q&A, but what I would like to start off with, because this is one that I've been thinking about a lot, how do we assess capacity for consent or assent? I mean, we've talked a bit about GILIC, but how do we do it? As ethics committees, what would we want to see in the applications, and where would we want to see it? If a researcher's putting in an application, they're saying they're going to use assent and consent, what do we think is good evidence? And, you know, what would we expect to see? Kaya.
I knew you were going to pick on me. I think it's an interesting question, because I don't, from a practical side of what I know that people are doing, rather than the evidence they give us or what they tell us they're doing, they're not using a formal GILIC competency framework to assess capacity. They're usually families and like children that they know well, and are using their clinical judgment and their relationship with them in a more organic way to determine whether they think that they have capacity to understand the particular research project, the context, and what it involves. And some of that comes out during the conversation, and gauging questions and asking their families, or children in this case, what they understand and what they don't understand. And we haven't really formalized, like in the protocols that we've seen, it's more like we will gauge whether they have the maturity and the capacity to consent. And if they do, we will do consent with that age, with those participants. So it'll be a change. And I don't know of anyone who has a strong answer about this. I know especially for the lower involvement research where there's lesser risk and less like time involved in the study, the amount of time required to do a formal Gillick competency assessment is preventing. Can't think of the word, but it basically prevents anyone doing it. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and so another sort of lead on for this, and anyone can choose to answer this or weigh in. Do we think parents have a role in assessing capacity? If we're providing assent options versus consent options, do you think parents are going to want to be involved in that assessment of whether or not they can do one or the other? Dalal.
I think it's good to allow parental involvement with consent or assent. They're the parents that see the child, young person, all day, every day. However, in saying that, it does at times dampen, depending on the experience of research involvement or ethical consideration involvement from that parent, as to say, can my child partake or participate, and when could they pull out, or when would they have challenges? So it is a bit in that two-phased sort of mind, and it does fall back on, yes, you want to give the child the ability and the space and the information, but you also need to ensure that if the parents sort of weigh in on the child's consent or assent, they also need to be completely informed and understand the parameters of whatever's going to be put in front of them.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Ed.
Thank you. Look, I agree with Jalal that I do think the parents, generally speaking, are the best people to determine whether or not the child or how the child's best able to indicate their assent. I think we need to be really clear, remind our researchers to be really clear that the default position is if you are less than 18, then we are relying on your parents in the legal framework they're in to provide consent to participate in research. And so if we want the child to provide their own consent, so the mature minor thing, that's where I think we need to be really exploring, and the bar needs to be quite high for, or at least explicit, not necessarily high, but explicit for the team to say, yep, you're 15, 16, 17, whatever it might be, you want to provide your own consent, which may be different to what your parents want you to do. Okay, help us be comfortable that you've got the ability to do that. Whereas most of the time, when we're thinking about what we've seen over in WA, is here is a parental consent form that, I'm happy for my child to participate in this study. We then look for, the child to provide or indicate they've got assent, either by signing or ticking a box or whatever. I think absolutely the parents and also the researchers are in a good position to say, yep, the child can sign here or not. And we've seen a number of sign here to indicate assent, child, if thought to be appropriate. And we've generally left it at if thought to be appropriate and assumed that the parents and the researcher is the best person to judge that. But the consent for the mature minor, that's where we really get interested, how you're going to assess capacity and see that capacity assessment done probably quite formally, or at least see some indications for how that capacity has been assessed.
Great. Thanks, Ed. Dalal.
That was really good, Ed. I do like a framework. I do like a method. I do like a guide. I'm wondering though, and this is something that a couple of people have already brought up, where I think it's quite essential to have young people as part of this conversation very early on, and not just one, maybe 3 or 4, to have that diverse approach for different reasons. I wonder though, if we have a set scenario where a parent, for whatever reason they choose to say no, and the young person, be it 12, 17, want to participate, are we then putting restraint or restrictions on their participation? And are they then going to say, well, if my parent doesn't want me to do it, but I want to, and then find out later, does that implicate them to say, well, okay, maybe there's something wrong, maybe I shouldn't participate? So there's that sort of dilemma as well. It's like a chicken or the egg. If the parent says it first and then the child says it, or if they're not together and they say it, it's that conversation. And I think it is a conversation piece to keep everybody informed at the same time, with applicable language used, to make sure that all information is being given and they can have that sort of that educated response, and also because this also then takes on and becomes a conversation at home, with younger siblings perhaps, and then it puts that idea of, okay, so what does research mean? What does participation mean? What does clinical trial and participation mean? And if we're going to go into that, so there's a lot to consider here, but I quite honestly believe that it's essential to have young people part of these conversations while they are being made, and a diverse group of young people and their families, for whether it be health needs or age or background, and a level of cognitive ability.
Thanks, Dalal. Gorden, and then Kaya.
Thanks, Sophie. So just got a bit of a tempest going on in the background, so you might hear some hailstones against the window. That's Brisbane for you in summer. Look, just as we were speaking, I've just been reading a 2021 paper titled Children's Understanding of Informed Assents in Research Studies. And I think it's relevant. So, Dalal makes some great points, absolutely. And I think I tried to say earlier that, when does assent mean yes and when does it mean no? And that paper was about ECGs, so children taking part in ECG studies, right? It's pretty straightforward research. So it's clearly always contextual, but there are always objective and subjective parts of it. And I guess ethics committees sort of need to almost you have to have objective criteria as well. Now, and your question is what are those criteria? And that's kind of a difficult question for this particular discussion, but they sort of have to be objective. But they also have to be specific to the particular research study, because as I try to point out, some are simpler than others, and if you leave it to parents, then there's no guarantee that parents are necessarily going to understand some complexity of some research studies either. So, most importantly, autonomy of the individual, and and the national statement in fact says that they should be involved in discussions and their views should be taken into account. It never says their views are authoritative, but for an HREC, who's trying to stand in the shoes of a decision maker, trying to ensure autonomy is observed, and sometimes it's necessary for the clinicians or whatever to come up with those objective criteria to make that decision in the first place. So I'm not sure ethics committees, unless they have the relevant expertise, can come up with the objective criteria for that decision. So I'll just stop there.
I agree. They can't. I hope that's why I want to ask the researchers what they think that criteria is, and then get that information from them. I think that the other question that reminds me of is should be training in assessing capacity? Is that something that we should be thinking about? Because not all of the people assessing capacity will be clinicians who are using a GILIC framework. There could be researchers doing research out in the community without that level of training. So is this now a new sort of module for training that researchers need to do to assess capacity to assent or consent? Over to you, Kaya.
I just wanted to echo Dalal's point around the order of consent. And I think that's really pivotal in terms of how the adolescent will potentially feel about the process. Like, is it different if their parent has had a big conversation and signed a consent form and now they're just agreeing to what their parents decided, or whether it's them first? And then what conversation is had with them about what does consent mean? If it's additional, or what does assent mean? Like, what are the consequences of this potentially? And what are they really signing up for beyond the research? Like, what does the actual process mean? And then along with that is, how do we document this, and what does that mean if we don't have a signature field for assent? Does that mean that the conversation didn't happen? Does that mean that they said no? And then what are the flow-on effects? Or if you have an empty field on a consent form page, if it's all in one, what does that mean? I think the pragmatic flow-on effects are tricky, and ideally we would have a single national approach to what that means. Like, I'm not giving answers, but more questions.
And what do we so with these, for those who aren't aware, up until recently, up until these changes, as we at the Children's, we were not accepting assent forms, even though assent forms would regularly come from commercial sponsors. So now we're going to have to think about how we do that. And as Kai said, like what does a signed assent form mean, and what sort of operational things are attached to that in terms of having to go back and get consent. So I want to segue to that question, because Gorden was interested in the answer, and I'm very interested in the answer too. What are people, do any of the HRECs currently operating, or anyone in the audience, are they aware of any sort of standard timelines on a reconsent for or assessing capacity for ability to reconsent? Because like we've said, children could start in a project and then, within a year they could have capacity to consent. So that's not something that we're very strict on with our researchers, in terms of getting that plan to say, at what point are you going to go back and reconsent these, or assess their ability to provide capacity to consent. And I'd be interested to know if anybody's got any solutions or ideas about that as well. Dalal?
So I can't answer the first part of the question. Second part of the question, in terms of capacity or to reconsent, I think it was. Yeah. So to give you a scenario, so I have an 11-year-old daughter who has an intellectual disability, and she and I are both part of a couple of research projects. And so one of the research projects, although I'm sitting there explaining everything to her using sign language, using her AAC device, and a couple of other prompts to help her understand what we're doing within that time frame, I'm always asking her, are we okay to keep going? But in doing that as well, over time, she's come to understand the process, the people that are involved, what we're expected to do, and how we're doing them. So we attend a meeting room, and these are the people that we see, and these are the people that we work with, and this is what we're working on. And over time, it's become easier for her to grasp that sort of piece of work and keep going. And so that it's reduced the amount of time I need to spend explaining and re-explaining, and her to give me the nod or this happy smiley face with that okay to let me know that yes, she's happy to go on to the next step. So very much if I sort of take that scenario and say, well, every year is another year someone develops and grows and understands. So if we have that mentality of, okay, do we need to reassess the reconsent or reassent or reaffirmate? Is that the process that needs to happen, or is it a different phase of a project that needs a reaffirmation of the consent? Once again, not a solution, just a thought.
I think, Dalal, what I was trying to suggest is that, reconsenting might be when a child was part of a research project and then has turned 18. You might have to reconsent them there. or reconsenting might take place when there are, new samples being collected or the project has been amended to some extent. But I think the reconfirmation of consent can be a simple process, but based on timelines. So they are slightly different things, but I think there are certainly in the US Code of Federal Regulations, there's a need to reconsent in certain circumstances, and probably that should be probably mirrored here, but not. I think as Sophie said, if every pediatric research thing had to go through an ethics committee, then they'd never get any work done. So it has to be risk proportionate as well.
Ed, and then Beck.
Thank you. Look, I think, Dalal, you describe what, as researchers and as HRECs, we anticipate and expect will happen all the time. And just because we're talking about assent now, I don't think we can get a bit caught up. And so I think every child participating in a project provides a level of assent to participate. My kids are big now, but, and certainly one of them was quite sick when they're younger. And, if my child's going to kick, scream, carry on and not come along, then guess what? We're going to say, no, we're not going to do the research today. Let's talk about it later. So that assent process, or that agreement process you described really nicely with your daughter who's 11, I think happens in a variety of ways with every single parent and every single child that's participating in research. So and has happened for a pediatric research since we started doing pediatric research, I think, so I think what we're seeing now, what we're discussing now is really appropriately, how do we make sure that kids have got information that's appropriate for them, and we can be more confident that they know what they're coming along to and participating in. But I don't think that process has fundamentally changed. So again, I've got a very simplistic way of looking at things. You can provide consent when you're 18 or younger in specific circumstances, and it becomes pointy where you want to do it and your parents don't. And there are a couple of particular things where that would be challenging. But most of the time, I think what we're talking about now with the assent is actually just that formalization to an extent of what's already happened and what's always happened. And I'll just very briefly touch on that extended consent and reconsenting when someone's 18. I think the genie's out of the bottle by then. So if your parents provided you your consent for your samples to go in a biobank somewhere else around the world, or even in Australia, when you're 12, 5, 15, you go and ask the child again when they turn 18, who knows where those samples are now. So I like the idea of reconsenting, but in a practical point of view, I don't know what we do then. And that's just, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I think once an extended consent's granted, and it is appropriate to grant it sometimes, I think, then the idea of reconsenting when you're 18 is tricky.
I agree, it is tricky, and I fear for what will happen in the future when different frameworks come in place that say we actually have to give children the rights to get their data back, or have the decision as to whether or not that continues to be used in research. So I'm thinking about how do we set our researchers up to continue things sustainably, because yes, who knows where those samples are going, but is that good enough? And as HRECs now, should we be saying, actually, we shouldn't be okay with that? We should be thinking that might happen, and that we should be ensuring that parents are aware of that. It might be that we have lots of very clear wording in the consent form, but again, it's buried in the consent form. So maybe it's about, coming together and building some really nice resources to communicate what biobanks are and what overseas, what it means for your samples to go overseas. I don't know, but it's very tricky, because I think there are things that we can't foresee that kids will be happy with in the future. And where does our responsibility start and finish as HRECs to sort of start feeding that back and planting that seed. I also don't know that we know all the answers, because we're not the youth. I'm not the youth, and the HREC that I'm on are not the youth. So how do we ensure that we're getting the voices of those people and what they want? Beck, you go ahead. And we've actually got a hand up from someone in the audience, but I don't know, can we take verbal questions on this platform? I think so.
I think you can.
Yeah, you can.
You just allow them to chat.
I'll just allow them to chat, but yeah, just when you're ready for me
Yeah,
to.
Beck, you go ahead, and then I'll get Soph to get Angela Lawrence's question. Beck.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know which one to respond to now. I was going to say similar to Ed on the reconsenting when you think they have capacity, that I think as HRECs we feel more comfortable if the information sheets are we can see that they're going to be understood by young people and kids. They're using videos, they're using infographics. I think we need to see that the team has made that real effort to be communicating with the child as well as the parent. And similar to clinical processes, I think we need to start thinking of it less as a tick, consent's done. It's got to be an ongoing process, that every time you have contact, or the researcher has contact with that family and that child, they need to reaffirm whether the child's happy to go ahead, whether the family's happy to go ahead. It doesn't need to be documented, but it should be a conversation, and the process that they outline to the HREC needs to show that they're doing that. Then the samples can of worms is a whole nother rabbit hole to go. And I agree with Ed in that, the genie is out of the bottle. But I also have concerns like Sophie that you can't unring a bell. And if, even though they say those samples are de-identified and they're out there, how do we know what tests are coming in the future? We know that there's protections in place at the moment that if that information can't affect their life insurance and the jobs that they get. But I think we've seen from the US that those safeguards can change at any time, and I just don't feel comfortable that it isn't going to impact kids down the track that aren't really giving their consent to provide samples, their parents are. And I think there's that distinction too between those biobanks where you're biobanking tissue from rare tumours or diseases, and you can tell the research projects that are coming in saying, we're just going to keep those extra samples because we might just come up with something to do with them later. And I don't think they should be treated the same way.
Gabe, I'll go to you, and then we'll go to... Oh, I lost our audience hand. No, our audience hand is gone. Okay, so
yep,
Gabe,
I can go. Yep. So just probably following on from Beck there, in terms of the ongoing access and reconsenting process, we ensure that we're trying to encourage researchers to make it very clear in their consent forms that whilst at this point in time we are unaware of the impact of that information on things like insurance and life insurance, we don't know how that's going to impact them in the future. So we actually try and point them to including that information in the consent. Just on a young person, we have 2 young people on our HREC. So we have 2 young members who we actually ask them to review all our patient information materials. So they actually, at our HREC meetings, are tasked with reviewing consent forms and participant information sheets. And that's been a really valuable contribution to our HREC. Some of the things that they often bring up are their capacity or ability to ensure participants can withdraw from research. So they want to know that participants can actually, at some point, withdraw their research, and that there's a smooth and tangible way for them to be able to do that. Some of the other things they flag are often around ensuring that the levels of communication are right. So we really encourage all our researchers to have, depending on the age of their research participants, a child information sheet, a young person information sheet, an adolescent information sheet, and then a parent. So we're usually reviewing 3 or 4 consent forms if we've got an across the age range kind of inclusion criteria, and they will always look at those for us as well. So I think finding those voices is really important, and it's something that our HREC has focused on in the last 18 months.
How old are they?
So we've got one young person who's he's just turned 18, and we've got another 21-year-old. Actually, our first young person actually is a bit younger than 17. He might, because he's off our consumer participant group from the network. So he's participated in 2 meetings, and just last week he was quite, great at being a little bit vocal and being able to contribute. So it often takes a bit of time for them to be able to feel comfortable to raise the things they want to raise, but we've got a couple of young voices probably for that age range as well.
And do you get them to focus on just the participant-facing material, or do they read the whole application?
Just the participant material. So
yeah, I think that's good.
Some of, obviously, the applications can be too broad for the number of documents that they can probably feasibly get through at times. So yeah, we try and ensure, without burning them out, because we can have a number of protocols to review, we try and pick the ones that we think actually a young voice is really important to review.
Amazing. Gorden.
Thank you, Sophie. Look, I want to address the genie out of the bottle issue. And irrespective of whether the genie's out of the bottle, so to speak, the fact is that an individual who's turned 18, and in fact, even one that's not 18, does have autonomy to decide what happens to their samples or information. So you can't just say the genie's out of the bottle, can't be bothered collecting consent. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it to be, I'm not trying to be rude, because that's not what this is about. It's that they still have the opportunity to say what can happen. All biospecimens or personal information should only have been used or disclosed, through an MTA or a DTA. So there should always be some governance around the use of personal information and biospecimens. And it's not perfect, but that's how you control it. And we all know that for old samples, they could be anywhere in the world, and you're absolutely right about that, Ed. But I don't think that's any reason not to determine through some form of reconsenting process whether that person who has turned 18 still wishes for those samples to be used in that way. I think to not do so sort of abrogates the ethics committee's responsibility of actually that rigor. So hope that's not too polemic, but I don't think genie being out of the bottle is a very good way to go.
Dalal.
I've got 2 questions. Gorden, it's really good to know that process or that protocol exists. I wonder, is that something that's standardized, and is that something that everybody knows or should know about it, even as parents going into that kind of space? And my other question was to Gabrielle, and if the participants or the young people who are engaged in the HREC committee meetings, which is great, I love hearing that, do they have an option to take part of a bit more in that engagement process if they wanted to?
So, Sophie, I might answer the first part of that for Dalal.
Yep, go ahead.
So interestingly, Dalal, I mean, if you're involved in a clinical trial and you're a minor, your data records have to be kept for 15 years after you're 18. So, if you have a neonate in the clinical trial, records have to be kept for 33 years. And so it's all good and well for an ethics committee to say, right, well, they're going to keep them for 33 years, but, put that back on the institution and, which researcher is going to be there 33 years later? And the answer is not that many. So only by probably having an appropriate data management plan, which includes a plan for the use of data and biospecimens, can we be certain that things are going to be managed appropriately? As to your question of whether or not that exists in all ethics committees, I don't think it's standardized. Let's just be honest about it. I think we do need to put some rigor around it, especially when we're talking about personal information, biospecimens, but we all have to lift our standards in that regard.
And I'll just answer the second part. Yes, they are more than welcome to, they are considered a HREC member, so they participate in the full meeting. They can contribute to discussions. They that side of their membership is as anybody else. If they want to look at any other additional documents related to the study, we can certainly talk through if they've got questions, if they want to check something against a protocol, we can help them with that. But generally, we try and just send them the participant-facing materials because we feel like that's probably the most important level to get their perspective on, but it's also not so overwhelming in terms of the numbers of documents they'd be needing to review. But yeah, they participate in full discussion and their opinions are held very highly.
How did you recruit them? Sorry, Dalal.
No, that's a really good question. Yeah.
So we recruited them through our, we have a young person's advisory within the network. So we have a consumer group of young clinicians that are young people who have come through the network as patients or consumers in our health service. And that's advertised at different points through the hospital. Obviously, some research teams are great at being able to advocate for some of their patients or participants to be interested and engage in and find out a bit more. So there's a group at the hospital, and then we were able to recruit through there. So and otherwise we had put feelers out through our research network. We've had a couple of young people come and observe a HREC, and the two who are currently on it both observed 2 meetings before they became official members.
That's good. Yeah, we've thought of something similar. We've had a little bit of trouble recruiting. We've thought of we've had quite a lot of trouble recruiting, actually. We've done a number of mail-outs, different groups. I think we've got our meeting goes for 4 hours of an evening, and I wonder if that's a bit of a drawback. But I do wonder if there's other ways of getting that voice and, not as much attendance, if that would be helpful. But I also, I in some of the ways that we would recruit, I would worry we'd get lots of uni students who have lots of experience who might be doing science degrees as well. So I'm trying to get that balance is how do we do that? But I think going through the research teams, the relationships they have with their participants might be helpful. There is a consumer patient group at the hospital as well. And we have tried to reach out to them, but we didn't have anyone.
And I think, Sophie, that's the difference is for us, it was really valuing the lived experience of somebody who has been both a participant and potentially somebody involved in research as well.
Yeah.
So that was key for us, but obviously it's challenging. Our meetings are, we try to have a 2-hour meeting once a month because we separate our HREC and science and have some other meetings. So, and it's a Friday afternoon. So it's a good time in that we can generally get involvement from them.
Yeah. And do you pay them, Gabby? Sorry.
No.
Do you pay them?
No, they're not paid. So.
I recently heard from a young person that was part of a pitch for the X Factor in research. That food goes a long way if you want participation from a young person. So, from an adult as well. I wonder, Gabrielle, I value young people participating in research at even university students. I've had the most pleasure working alongside uni students who put their hand up or after I've given a lecture about invisible or non-invisible disability coming up to me and wanting to work with us in different capacities. But upskilling young people who put their hand up to participate in, reviewing or giving feedback in these kinds of spaces. I wonder if that's something that would incentivize young people to participate for their own, skills and expertise and opening up their networks, especially people with lived experience, and opening up other avenues for them to explore and to network and to get them out of their shell as well, because they've got so much to say. She's young, she's 6, she sometimes thinks she's 16, she's got a lot to say about everything. So there's so much value in the engagement of young people and what they have to say in their own health. But yeah, just generally, I wonder if that's something that could be used as an incentive to get their buy-in.
I think that's a really good idea. Sorry, you go ahead, Gabrielle.
No, I was going to say yes, certainly, and obviously we engage them once in the beginning and really have opportunities to talk them through what their involvement looks like, what ethics is about. Our research office really works closely with them just to ensure they feel comfortable to understand what their role is and what they're contributing to. They have access to pretty much all the same information that a HREC member will have access to in terms of resources, any of those things we would, try and give them, but obviously target it at a level where they feel like it's not overwhelming to begin with.
Thank you. Well, we're getting close towards being almost out of time, but there has been one question in the chat that I think is worth talking about, involving young people in research who actually when parental consent actually might be a barrier to young people taking part in research and also getting the answers about a particular topic, whether it be a sensitive topic or something about their sexual health or about anything else that they may not want to have their parents' input in. From our perspective at the Children's, we have approved research projects where the young person's consent might be acceptable without the parents, there's, like Ed said, 18 is the legislative framework we work under, but we might say that something's ethical despite that legislative framework, and we still have to run that past the lawyers to say, is your risk appetite here with that? Has anyone else got comments on how they've dealt with those ethical decision making for including young people in research without their parents' consent? Beck?
Yeah, I think we do, I wouldn't say often, but probably regularly approve. And I think the national statement has made those provisions around the circumstances where that's okay. It's often for things like youth justice or where you would be putting the child at risk. They might be estranged from their parents, or one example was some school nurses were doing a project on whether their vaping program was working within the schools, and the kids that were involved in that program obviously hadn't told their parents they were vaping. So we approved that, but they're usually quite low risk, and they're often surveys or interviews, and I can't recall approving one where there was an intervention as such.
Yeah, I think we've had at least one example I can think of where we were asked to approve something that was an intervention, and we struggled with that one, despite the lived experience committee really advocating for us to provide that provision for consent without parents there. And it's tricky because, and I think in the end we said no, we should be getting parental consent. And I think it also goes to whether or not you can apply it to a group or you have to apply it individually, because it could be different for each person within the project, not just the group that you're targeting. We are at 4:59, and we could probably talk about this for a lot longer. I'm just going to ask the panel quickly, is there any final thoughts that anybody wants to share before I say thank you very much and let everybody go and do the things that they want to do this afternoon, depending on where you are? No one? All right. So 5 o'clock. Boom. Thank you, everyone, for taking part in this discussion this afternoon. Thank you for the audience for making the time to attend. And I hope everybody has got lots of conference sessions booked for the rest of the week, and they enjoy all of the wonderful conversations and sessions that the conference has to offer. And hopefully we can, I'm certainly going to be stealing some of Gabrielle's approach to getting the lived experience young people on the committee. So we've all learned something that we can do today. And yeah, good happy HREC conference, everyone. And thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.